wonderful to see you all. Thank you for joining us for this really important conversation. It is wonderful to see your beautiful faces. Welcome. My name is Xiomara, and I'm going to get us started here today. Before I do, I want to make sure folks know we do have Spanish interpretation available for you throughout our time today. If that's something that you would like to access, you're going to go into your Zoom menu, look for that globe icon, and then just click on that to change the language. I want to make sure you know that's available for you. So let me do a quick introduction. And for those of you who are just getting to know us, we do our introductions in a way that might be a little bit different. Here at Promise 54, we call it radically human introductions. And so what we do is we try to center the things that truly matter most to us in this moment on this day, as opposed to solely focusing on credentials or degrees or networks, as many of us may have been socialized to introduce ourselves in a professional space. So I'm going to start off and model that. My name is Xiomara, and my radically human introduction goes something like this. My pronouns are she and her. I identify in lots of different ways, including as a cisgender, able-bodied Latina, a queer woman, daughter, a little sister, a wife, a titi, a mother, and an aspiring warrior for racial justice. My Roman Catholic Puerto Rican mother, who grew up low income in the South Bronx, met my Muslim first-generation immigrant dad from Bombay in college. They fell madly in love. They together became the first in their families to graduate from college. They went on to get their PhDs together, and together they broke the intergenerational cycle of poverty for our family. Their experiences inform my passion around educational equity work, which is where I've spent my career. I grew up watching them form connection across so many lines of difference, from spices and food to rhythms and language to religion and so much more. And for them, that was very much a big part of the definition of love. And today, it informs a lot of my approach to this idea of building radically human spaces where people can connect deeply across line of difference and ultimately thrive. I'm a wife to an amazing woman who I've been with for 21 years. We've been illegally married for 9 years. We've been legally married for 4 years. And I'm a mother to a kind, brave, smart 9-year-old who questions everything and loves with abandon. And she is homeschooling downstairs because of a COVID outbreak in her classroom, a reality that I know many of us are so familiar with these days. And I'm the proud founder and CEO of Promise 54. In case you're just meeting Promise 54 today, we are a national nonprofit, and we exist in order to help other organizations create internal spaces where your adults can truly thrive so that they can do their best work, and because we all deserve that. We do our work in lots of ways, including tailored one-on-one support partnerships, also cohort experiences where we bring organizations together to advance common work, and national research, like the research that we're going to be anchoring in today, which is our Unrealized Impact 2.0 report. Now, we released the first report in this series in 2017, based on data from 5,000 individuals and 200 organizations. And what we wanted to understand was, how is the education sector doing on DEI? The results were sobering and showed that we had a really long way to go. So we continued to collect the data, analyze the data, and we just released this brand new 2.0 report just 1 month ago. It includes data from 28,000 individuals now across 500 organizations. It's the largest study of its kind on DEI in the field of education. Unrealized Impact 2.0 represents a bold call to action for organizations to engage in the work of becoming diverse, inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist, because we believe it's a precondition for social justice. And one of the many things that we study in this report is demographics across the field of education to see how we're doing representing the communities that we serve generally and in the roles with most positional power, as well as by organization type. I'm going to ground us today in this as we zoom in on the philanthropic sector. Philanthropy has a long way to go. According to our data, 62% of staff in the philanthropic sector today are white. That's the least racial ethnic diversity of any organization type. And that representation gap only gets larger as we move up through the layers of positional power, where we find that 80% of CEOs in the philanthropic sector are white. I'm going to pause and say that again. 8 out of 10 CEOs, the people with the most power, potentially the most influence, access to decision-making and resources, many of them working on behalf of Black and Brown communities every day. 8 out of 10 CEOs in philanthropy are white. That's the least diversity at the CEO level of any organization type. And when we look at staff experience, or what are staff experiencing in their organizations in relation to diversity, inclusion, and equity, we see that 67% of staff nationally are experiencing their organizations as diverse. 62% are experiencing their organizations as inclusive. And that same 62% are experiencing their organizations as equitable nationally across the country. But as we zoom in on the philanthropic sector, the numbers drop dramatically, where only 55% of staff in the philanthropic sector are experiencing their organizations as diverse, only 58% as inclusive or places of belonging, and only 55% of staff in philanthropy are experiencing their organizations as equitable or fair. It's pretty profoundly concerning. We have to dig in and understand at a deeper level what's happening, why, what are the consequences, how do we fundamentally transform the philanthropic sector? And that's why I am so incredibly excited about the amazing group of Black and Brown current and former funders that are joining us here today, that have agreed to enter into a fishbowl type discussion with each other and generously allow us to bear witness. We're going to invite reactions, affirmations, thoughts in the chat. So please feel free to throw those in there whenever you have them. And if you have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat as well. And we'll do the best we can to weave some of those in. I could not be more thrilled today to be welcoming Brandon Zeigler, the powerhouse director of impact at Global Endowment Management, who previously worked at the Walton Foundation. We have the very courageous Darryl Cobb, who is the president of the Charter School Growth Fund and previously worked at the KIT Foundation. I'm thrilled to welcome the fierce Francis Messano, who is the president at New Schools Venture Fund, previously worked at Teach for America and Monitor Institute. The warrior that is Margarita Florez Vasconcelos, who is currently an independent consultant and previously worked at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And Tulaine Montgomery, who takes the world by storm and is currently the co-CEO of New Profit. Along with, last but not least, the amazing force that is Heather Harding, who is on our advisory panel for the Unrealized Impact 2.0 report, just co-authored a blog with me on this very topic about DEI and philanthropy, works at the Schusterman Foundation, and in her free time, serves on Promise 54's board. Heather, I'm going to hand it over to you to engage alongside our amazing panel in some unplugged conversation about reactions to the data, what you see going on in philanthropy and the sector broadly in relation to DEI and racial justice work. And perhaps y'all could start with your own radically human introductions. Over to you, Heather.
To follow that lead. Thank you, Xiomara, and thank you, Promise 54, for the very important research that we can then draw from. If I'm going to go the route of a radical introduction, first of all, I am a winner of many karaoke contests, Francis. That's a first. Second of all, I am a mother of teenagers, which is a very big job. I am a poet. I am a singer. I strive to practice radical love, like in the spirit of Ella Baker. And I think those are the key features of who I'm trying to be in the world. I'm going to go to each of the panelists to share their radically human introduction. So here's the order: Margarita, Brandon, Francis, Darryl, and Tulaine. Margarita, over to you.
Hi, I'm Margarita Florez Vasconcelos. I am a mom, a former teacher, and a principal. These days, when I have a minute to spare, I go find my little one and go in for a snuggle. I'm becoming my mother. I'm like desperately seeking extracurricular activities to sign up my little one to. Anything that will take a 14-month-old. He starts gymnastics at Berkeley next week. I'm a Mexican immigrant with an American Peruvian father. My grandmother was an indigenous woman who was stolen from her community. My grandfather was a socialist leader in Mexico, working on behalf of people. I show up with a mix of identities. I grew up upper middle class. Latina immigrant, and part of a family, my father's side, where whiteness is highly protected.
Hey, I'm Brandon Zeigler with Global Endowment Management, also known as BZ to those I am close to. I'm a former banker turned educator turned funder and now an investor. I am a Black man who was raised in the South and am back living in the South. So a lot of my thoughts are framed as somebody who grew up exposed to very personal racism and also systemic racism from a young age. I believe in authenticity. I believe in serving and being there for those who are underserved and underinvested in. And I can honestly say that the people who know me best know that I will always show up for them, regardless of how long the runway is or how far away we find ourselves.
I love these. I feel like I know you all, and yet I'm learning so much at the same time. Hi, everyone. I'm Frances. I am a Latina, first-generation college graduate, daughter of a Colombian immigrant, Anna, who was undocumented in this country for 8 years, and daughter to an Italian father, Paul, from Brooklyn, that never had access to educational opportunity. I was raised in the working class community of Coney Island, Brooklyn. My sister is my best friend, and I am a titi to her son, Phoenix. I am the firstborn daughter to a firstborn daughter to a firstborn daughter. And my work in education is a tribute to my mother, Anna Nelsi, who became a paraprofessional, went to college at nights and on weekends as my sister and I were getting older, and eventually became a kindergarten teacher. Through my work, I am paying it forward for the support that I receive from countless nonprofits that provided me with access to opportunity. So that's Prep for Prep, SEO, and MLT. And those experiences have taught me how to be a bridger and a translator across worlds and across experiences. And I use this superpower to be an in-system activist for change. I'm coming to marriage and motherhood later in life. And for a long time, it was another ism that I was facing, right? Why are you still single? Why don't you have kids? It must be because. And now I am a partner to Maurice and a caregiver to Maurice Jr., Desi, and Danny. Music is incredibly important to me. It is my culture. It's the salsa dancing that I grew up doing in my family living room. It's the singing I've done in countless choirs and cover bands. And yes, there's some karaoke competitions too. It is my self-expression, and singing reminds me that I am free.
Thank you, Frances. And of course, this is the time when my Comcast decides that it's going to flicker in and out. So apologies if you all see me go on and off video, as my network is telling me that I have low bandwidth right now. So timing is everything. And I'm always honored to follow behind Frances. I am Darryl Cobb, and love these intros. Mine goes a little like this. I am the great grandson of someone who was born into slavery and experienced an emancipation. I am the grandson of someone who made the Great Migration to find a better path for his family. I'm the son of parents who grew up and were shaped during the civil rights era. And I'm a father to two wonderful children who their first recollection of a president was a brother who lives down the street from us. Those are the things that drive me. I'm a husband to a wonderful wife. I'm someone who loves my faith. I'm someone who loves being Black. For my nerds out there, I'm someone who loves Star Wars so we can talk about the upcoming book of Boba with anybody later after this call. And I'm someone who tries to live into what I believe I was called to do. And that's to help uplift at every turn people who look like me and the communities that have been overlooked and underserved. And I try to be better at that each and every day.
That's brilliant. I love it. It's like I want to take in these introductions, you know. There's so much food in them. So hey y'all, I'm Tulaine Montgomery with New Prophet. And you know, Darryl, you set the tone. I was wanting to invoke ancestors when I thought about radically human introductions. And so I am the daughter of Joyce Johnson and Pharrell Johnson. I am the granddaughter of Luella Reed and Clifton Bailey. I am the great granddaughter of the master healer and practitioner and matriarch, Deanna March Jacobs. And of my ancestors, there's many that walk with me in many ways. My ancestor who walks most closely with me is my great grandmother on my mother's side, Deanna, because she lived a life that was centered around love, strength, clarity, and discernment. She also had a beautiful voice. And so my love for music and song comes from my lineage. It's hardwired into me. I am the daughter of parents who, Darryl, like your parents, were children of the civil rights movement. I'm also the daughter of a master drummer, as named by ancient Ghanaian tradition when he was a young man. The marking is carved into his arm and I think that was when he was 22. And the reason that is important is because through the way I was raised, I am a daughter of the African diaspora in a very true sense. And much of my life and my identity and my worldview is formed by understanding the ways that Black people are connected globally, as well as locally. Because my father is a drummer, because my family is musical, I am also a musician and a playwright. And I see much of the world through the lens of being a creative. And for a while, when I was earlier in my days in this world of philanthropy and social impact, I wasn't sure how that fit into the world of strategy and capital allocation and evaluation. And what I now understand is the interplay between my creative self, my strategic self, my activist self, and my spiritual self. It's the interplay between all of those parts of me that enables me to do something that will hopefully enable me to be a good ancestor when it's all said and done. So I am really glad to be here with all of you and look forward to this conversation. Thank you for holding space.
Well, we're going to get into this because time is of the essence. So I will take the top three. Who wants to start with, what are your reactions to this report? Let's see if you had any surprises, because I think one of the things that called me to join ZMR and writing the blog post was I was a little surprised that the numbers in education philanthropy had not really budged, because I experience a lot of in and out. So curious, just general reactions, we'll start there, and then I'll nudge us forward, but people should just jump into the conversation.
I'll jump in and just say I was not surprised. You know, I mean, it's in line, the results of the report are in line with other findings around health outcomes, around wealth gap, around, you know, in many, across multiple dimensions of the lives of people of color, we're seeing that press releases, pledges, and initiatives do not transformation make, right? So to the degree that there is a theme of either no movement, or even in some cases, when we talk about the wealth gap for people of color as compared to our to white peers in this country, negative movement. It's clear to me that like it calls for a sort of a reconfiguration, transformation of our strategy and our approach. Doing more of what we've always done and expecting it to yield something different, I think is a fool's errand. And so I'm really curious about, okay, what we've been doing, because we've been doing it hard. We've been going hard and going long on this, and the results aren't changing. So what is it that we need to do differently that may sound even a bit crazy, or to use a word we've been using, radical. Like I think we got to figure out different strategies. Our tactics, I believe, are for the most part ineffective. And so I'm excited about what tactics will actually yield transformation.
Yeah, Tulaine, to your point, I think I also wasn't surprised. And I knew getting into this work that it was going to be hard, to your point. But what I've been surprised by is how slow the work is. As a former teacher and principal, you learn to make changes quick, right? Because your students depend on it. You get data, you see that it's not leading to outcomes, and you make changes. And that's what I'm surprised by in our field, not so much the report, but that's change is so slow, especially when it's on behalf of education and kids.
Francis, you look like you're ready to get in.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I also was not surprised. And Margarita, I feel like I'm not surprised either by the slow pace of change. Like, in so many ways, I had the privilege of being involved in Unrealized Impact 1.0, with Xiomara from the ground floor. And the reason why we did the project was because the questions that kept on coming up as we were trying to advance work focused on diversity, work focused on racial equity, right, was, well, how do we know that the field is not diverse? How do we know that education leadership is not diverse? How do we know that? There's no data. Where's the data, right?
Skepticism.
Sorry?
Skepticism,
right? How do we know that focusing on this issue is actually going to drive any change, right? And so I think despite like what everyone's been saying about there being press releases and potentially pledges and new initiatives, the thing that hasn't changed is the underlying mindset and the underlying orientation and the underlying belief that diversity and a focus on racial equity is a lever for change, right? By focusing on these issues, I believe we will get to more equitable outcomes in education. And I think there's tons of research that exists to support that, right? But I think what we're asking folks to do, particularly in philanthropy, given the demographics of who is in the work, we're asking people to understand an experience that is so far and so outside of their own day-to-day, right? And to understand how, for so many of us in this country, we are not set up for success. And so unless we do the mindset work, the change work, right, we know the data can only go so far. You can poke holes in data. You can show data in particular ways. And so for me, of course we haven't gone there, because until we get to a point where folks are like, yes, I can actually agree that my experience is not the average experience of someone, like, we're just not going to get there. We're just not going to get there. So I think this change is going to continue to be slow unless we decide, to go on this deeper journey of learning, of interrogating our assumptions. And so that's probably what you were seeing on my face.
So there are a few elder states people, I'm gonna get this right, on the call, because the next question really talks about like, what do you see differently from 10 years ago to now? I've been in philanthropy for almost 7 years now. I don't see any difference. In fact, I do see a hyper focus on impact. And I think I attribute that now to the giving pledge, the giving circle. There's a particular orientation in ed philanthropy that you got to measure everything or it doesn't matter. So I'm wondering, I think there's some like people rushing to that. But the reason why I was surprised was because I meet a lot of you. I seek you out. I mean, when I came to philanthropy, I said, oh, who else looks like me? Who else has some experiences like me? And I was surprised to find there's a lot of us around, sort of. But our connections to each other were thin, and our understanding of how to navigate internally was just really low, right? And so I'm wondering, like, for those of you who have been in this game for a little bit longer, what do you think is different now? And to pick up on Tulaine's challenge around radical, what could we be doing differently?
Maybe I'll take a first shot. I'm not sure that I am elder statesman on this.
Yes.
I think
Yes, you
there are a couple of people on this call who've been around in this work much longer than I have. But I want to make sure that as we're thinking about this, that we're thinking about the three things that all impact philanthropy at three different levels. So I recognize the Unrealized Impact Report has focused specifically on the experiences of people of color inside of philanthropic organizations. So maybe I'll come back to that one last. The two that we didn't touch on that I think there has been some change, and we also need to accelerate the pace of change, are one, are there more dollars going out the door? So despite what's happening inside of organizations, are there more dollars going out the door to organizations that are led by people of color? And so if you ask me, where was that bar 10 years ago? And where is that bar today? I have seen some organizations that have made significant progress on that. Is the progress enough? No. You know, my organization, I think Francis's organization, if you look back 10 years, the profile and mix of our investments was very different than it is today. But I want to make sure that when we're looking at this, we're thinking and asking ourselves and challenging ourselves, how, because ultimately, even if we do all the work great and everybody in philanthropy feels great, if we're not getting more resources into the hands of our leaders who are doing the work, then none of this matters. So I just, you hear my passion on that. Like, let's get dollars out the door, right? The second thing where I don't think there's been much movement in the time that I've been in this work is, so you got dollars going out the door, you got all of us sitting here in the middle, and then you got the people who made the money to start the foundations or the organizations that all of us are working at, right? So where I think there hasn't been a lot of movement, and to Tulaine's point about the wealth gap in this country, is we need more people who look like us, who have the means to be the principal funders and start the foundations and do the work that we're doing. And so I think lots of times people think about our work as centered around and contained in education, but our work is about ensuring that our young people have the chance to be the ones who are funding our work when they get older. And I want to be intentional about that. And then I think the lane that we're focused on here and with Unrealized Impact and I was not surprised by really anything that was in there. And the great work that Margarita and team have done is, I think, what is different than was different 10 years ago. 10 years ago, people were talking a little bit about the D. So how diverse are teams and can we get representation? 10 years ago, there was no talk about the I and very little talk about the E, right? And so today we're having conversations about what are people's experiences inside of the organizations that we're all part of. And that is different. Those experiences, per the data, are not as good as they should be or nowhere near where they should be. But that is a major difference from the conversation that was happening when I stepped into philanthropy a decade ago.
I mean, just to lift up, this was actually in the chat, and I want to lift it up because I think it deserves to be voiced. Nithya raised this point: unrestricted dollars out the door to BIPOC leaders, right? So, you know, in Profit, we did a report, Inclusive Impact report, maybe about 3-4 years ago now, actually, and, you know, found, like many other reports have found, that there is a disproportionate underinvestment in leaders of color. But we also looked into the dimensions of that funding and the level and number of restrictions and the restrictions, much higher level of restrictions, duration of the grant cycles were shorter, number of touch points required to secure the funding. So it's not only about the volume of capital, it's also about the features of that capital. And so unrestricted is essential, because unrestricted capital, as we know, for any business leader, entrepreneur, or, you know, white nonprofit leader, enables you to implement what you believe is necessary to get the job done. And what we need is more BIPOC leaders who have the resources they need need to do what they know and see needs to be done. It's really simple. At surface level, it's simple. It's about the lack of collective will to implement what is actually pretty straightforward. So I do want to underscore and lift up Nithia's point about unrestricted dollars. It's really about that, and I do see that as something that's starting to happen more. We're hearing more conversations. 10 years ago, I mean, I've been in the game a little bit longer, but not that much longer, Heather, than you, about 9.5 years now. And what is true is that when I started, talking about unrestricted money was reserved for the white and those affiliated with elite institutions, right? And there was no even notion that if you didn't have that quote unquote pedigree, right, using that with lots of air quotes, that you could handle unrestricted money, right? And I do think it's begun to shift. It's not where it needs to be, but we're now moving to a point where it is not a radical idea that the majority of funding should be unrestricted if we really believe in the insights of communities and leadership.
Yeah, I want to tie together this theme of, like Francis talked about, you can't ask people who haven't had the experience to understand the experience unless there's a bridge. And I want to connect that, like who's in the seats making these decisions, both about the amounts and the restriction or unrestricted nature, and then why the seats are still overwhelmingly white. For those, go on, Francis. I know you want to get in here. And Brandon, I'm gonna call on you because you have a set lunch.
No, let's go to Brandon. Please, Brandon.
I agree with everything that's been said with Darryl. The only thing I would add to it, and let me say this, like this is based off of my 5 years experience at one foundation, which I jumped my toe into philanthropy and then I got the hell out. And I have some fundamental beliefs that have been developed over my past decade or so in life that like encourage me to move in that different direction. But the last thing I'll say that I have seen a change in is a willingness to try to get more proximate to the people impacted by decisions you're making. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's positive in my mind. When I first joined the Walton Family Foundation in 2016, we were very much a parachute in. We have a thought, we have an idea, we're going to execute this agenda. And over the course of time, I made sure to push in my specific portfolio to like be on the ground, talk to people. Not only folks who are decision makers, but like, let's talk to moms, let's talk to students, let's talk to dads, let's go to the barbershop, let's spend time on the soccer field, and let's hear what's going on and how decisions we are influencing are impacting the actual lived experience of the people we hope to positively affect. So for me, this push over time, over the 5 years, I've seen to get more proximate to issues and to solutions and to people is definitely a positive. On the other hand, like when we think about all this change and we think about the Unrealized Impact Report 2.0, and it was interesting, just not to jump backwards, but I think for me, the biggest thing that I'm not surprised about and, stays with me is that as philanthropy as a sector, I feel like lacks the moral courage to like do what's right. You have individuals, you have certain foundations that have the moral courage to lead and do things that's right. But as a sector, we're okay with the results that we get or don't influence positively because we don't have the moral courage to step up and say what we see is fundamentally wrong and we want to change it. We're okay discussing it in the academics ecosystem, right? We can have reports, we can have policy debates, but when it actually talks about the impact on the child that lives next door to you as far as the education they're receiving, there's a lack of like putting resources in to do what's right. And I think there's a lot to be said as funders who are sit in seats as allocators, right? And for folks who like me now sit in seats as like allocating capital, right? Very similar thoughts and ideas. But to be a part of organizations that allow us as folks who sit in the seat to execute strategy, to like lead with the courage and not have to worry about losing a job, not have to worry about being blacklisted, not being able to develop and grow. So I think there's this aspect of moral courage that needs to develop more strongly in philanthropy to do better.
Brandon, to your point, we're also talking about a field that necessitates moral courage to do the right thing because of the lack of accountability. Like with the exception of intermediary funds that right, like for Francis and Darryl, you all have to, there's accountability to, well, and Tulaine, right? Like new property.
What to
You're
say.
accountable. Yeah, you're accountable to foundations, institutional foundations, but we are requiring, incentivizing foundations to do the right thing because there aren't accountability measures in place. And I think that is actually incredibly problematic for the sector.
And
Yeah.
it just strikes me as a tragedy because, like, you know, I'm a bit of an etymology geek, right? I love looking at the origin of words and phrases. So many phrases that are like common in American English just come from horrific origins. But like the etymology of the word philanthropy is to love humankind. The idea that, you know, philanthropy would be a place where you would look beyond your immediate circumstance and care for someone other than yourself, who you may never know, touch, or see. And the idea, and it should actually, I agree with you, Brandon, philanthropy, if you look at capital stack structures, ideally philanthropy is, you know, risk averse, to use, you know, sort of certain framework. It is where you go first and fastest with the least fear. And it could open the pathway to other sources of capital if it were functioning in the brave way that you, Brandon, described. So I think like the potential of philanthropy is so significant, and maybe even the intent of it from a systems view, but the way that it's operating as a field, there is this cautiousness, this fear, this tenuousness. And it's ironic to me because the potential is almost the opposite of the behavior.
100%, Tulaine. And I think especially in this moment in time, it's like, what else do we need to see? We're having this once in a lifetime generational moment as we face these two twin pandemics and have no idea what the months ahead, the years ahead are going to bring, right? With the systemic uprising that we had against racial injustice and COVID, and yet money continues to sit on the sidelines, right? Because we're in strategy refresh mode, right? Or we're not exactly sure what we should be allocating our money to. And your point, Tulaine, right? What is charity? Charity, it should be philanthropy should be focused on quickly moving dollars in a flexible way to the strongest leaders with the most promising ideas for change. And as we talk about education right now, we must today, right now, reimagine the system to be far more equitable, right? So that every single kid is going to address their unfinished learning, or going to get the mental health and social emotional supports they need. That is racial equity work, right? I believe education is racial equity work, and we need to build on all the focus on leaders of color and the new solutions that people are bringing, but it's towards that end. And the thing that I keep asking myself is like, why not now, right? What else do you need to see to get motivated for us to think about doing this work differently, where it is about unrestricted capital, where it is about flexible ways of deploying money to meet this particular moment? And I think it all comes down to control, right? Control and power, right? And the preservation of jobs, right? And the preservation of that power, right? Here is the moment where we can say, for 2 years, let's just stop. Let's just do it differently. Let's just do it differently and see what happens. And instead there's inaction, right? But this is coupled with something, right, that Xiomara and I were talking about the other day, which makes it so hard to engage. It is coming along with this moment of increased literacy on how you talk about equity, right? So Xiomara was talking about this. And I was like, tell me more, Xiomara, tell me more. She's like, well, we all have the language, you all have the words. New York Times just wrote an article on this, right? It is in our culture. We know to say racial equity, we know to say BIPOC, we know to say, of course, diversity matters. But what that all masks is the fact that we are not willing to move and not willing to act differently, right? And no one can make philanthropy do it, right? So then what?
Well, so in some ways, that's what makes having people of color in these seats so powerful, a powerful opportunity. I know, Margarita, that you have a story to tell. I mean, I recently have been thinking a lot. I'm a researcher. I do qualitative research, or I did. And I believe in what gets measured gets done. And yet in philanthropy, where the accountability is self-determined, this measurement stuff does not feel right to me. And when I see inaction, or what funders might be doing instead of getting off the shelf, putting money out, I see them working on strategy. I see them developing measurement. I see them bringing people in, whether they be consultants or staff, to develop the flow chart of how the money then leads to this, to leads to that, instead of assessing risk of proximate leaders and moving. And so I do believe that my responsibility around measurement has to shift as the person at the table who is the research expert. But I wonder, like, what is the value of you being in this seat as a leader of color? I mean, in my interview, I made sure I said, by the way, personal goal, getting as much money to Black and brown leaders as possible. Let's just be clear what you're getting. You're not getting something else. I'm super smart, I promise. I did my work. I'm well educated. I got some pedigree, but let's just be clear. My view will be in this way. So I feel very comfortable in that seat, which I know everybody doesn't have that privilege. But I wonder, like, what are the levers that you individually feel like you can pull and can't pull? And then I want to go to the white leader responsibility co-conspirator question. So I'm just saying all that.
I mean, I think for me, it was, as when I was a teacher, I started seeing people go off to do philanthropy work, but most of the people that were going off to do that were white men. So I was like, that's not the real work, right? I'm in the classroom doing the real work. But like something stuck with me. Why are all the white men going to go do this? Right? Like it was kind of, I both at the same time was like, I'm doing the real work, but there's something there because I associated power with whiteness. And it wasn't until I was a charter school principal that I was forced to both acknowledge and recognize the power of philanthropy, right? As a charter school principal, I needed philanthropic dollars to keep the lights on. But all the funders that we worked with at the time, all the funders that and so I began to wonder what could be possible if people like me who share the experiences of students and communities were the ones making decisions about where the money was. But I naively believed that representation would be this linchpin to upending like the white supremacist values and systems that we hold on to in philanthropy. And it wasn't. When I was at CZI, our staff became incredibly diverse. Not our leadership, but our staff did. I left our education program team when we were about 65% people of color. So there's diversity, there's representation. But what we needed was inclusion and getting to do inclusion right. And that, like, to do inclusion means you have to give up power. You have to give up access. You have to give up success to some degree. And I think that's really hard. It's not just hard for white people. It's hard for everyone. Because part of the reason I went into philanthropy was because I wanted power. I wanted to make decisions and be the person making the decision around where the money was going to go. And so in order to do inclusion right, in order to do the work that we're talking about, I need to be willing to give up that power.
Please go.
I mean, there's so much, Margarita, what you said. It's a word, as they say, like that was truly a word. And I think, the old expression, all skin folk ain't kin folk. I don't know if y'all have heard that. That's an old expression, from back in the day. Before all of our time, my grandmother used to say that to me. So, and I think that what that all skin folk ain't kin folk means is that, representation alone presumes shared values, shared sort of diagnostic of what is right, what is wrong, what is needed, right? All of that, and that's not true, right? That's certainly not true across any community. And when you talk about multiple communities under the BIPOC umbrella, like it's actually a ludicrous idea that representation alone, right, would be enough to change anything. It would just mean the people who are in the system maybe have different degrees of melanin, perhaps, right? Maybe they've come from a slightly broader network of academic institutions, but it doesn't actually change the system. So it's interesting to me, like, what would it take? I think a lot these days about what energizes me, and the sort of self-care movement, they say focus on what gives you energy, right? And, I'm these days really energized by work that's about not simply fighting what's existing and what's wrong in the system, but really designing the alternative. Because here's the thing, if we had, to your point, Margarita, if we had foundations that were led by people of color and 80% folks of color, if they're operating within the same system where the same things are valued and the same things, Heather, to your point, are measured, and the same grant-making structures exist, it's not going to be any different. In fact, it will be more painful because we presumed that representation was going to change the game. So I'm really interested in and welcome opportunities for us in partnership to think, with a kind of a liberated imagination, right? They talk about decolonize your imagination, and I'm with that, because like, what does it mean to design a new model that actually just makes the existing model obsolete, right? Like, that's really interesting to me, and it's scary and it's complex, and sometimes it gets dismissed as not practical and real, but like, what else is more practical than figuring out a future that actually works for our communities? So I feel like that kind of effort, that kind of collaboration in philanthropy is needed. And too often we're either digging our heels into the current practices or we're fighting against what's unjust. And those are valuable things to do, but they're insufficient to actually build an alternative philanthropic sector that can play the roles that, Brandon talked about earlier, that can have the kind of courage that Brandon referred to.
Darryl,
One thing that's really interesting.
Go ahead, Brandon.
I was gonna say one thing that's very interesting to me, like we've talked a lot about, and we've used the word power very specifically, whether you're sitting in the seat as a person of color with power to grant and fund organizations that are run and look by people that look like you. But what's very interesting when I think about my time is thinking about internally how funders, and like when I'm talking about funders, I'm talking about actual foundations and the systems or institutions kind of look at power, right? And one of my thoughts, and I never quite figured it out, like I saw little glimpses and pieces of my portfolio, but never figured out how to really structurally like design this pathway. Foundations are very comfortable funding Black and brown people to do grassroots work. We'll dole out dollars for that. We'll tell you, we have these ideas where we want you to make sure you rally the troops and get people to show up. But we're not funding these organizations to develop true advocacy power to shape policy and to create structural and systemic change. And that's an area of power that I think we need to figure out how to elevate all of the work we do. Like for me, I got sick and tired of seeing Walton fund so much grassroots work by people of color, but never excited to really fund that Black or brown person, that Latinx person, that Southeast Asian person to do some policy work. And I think when we get to the place where we actually create a pathway to like have policy and advocacy power, that's when you start making real systemic change. And we've got to figure out how to make sure that we have access to those rooms, those conversations. Otherwise, we'll continue to just stay around, play in the same sandbox, and we'll never be able to get to an area where like we're out of the sandbox and controlling decisions, right? So that's the one interesting thing to me when I think about power. It's like I just want to figure out also like all the folks who are doing that grassroots on the ground work, how do we elevate them into a place where like they develop those advocacy chops to really influence those decisions? Because that's the point where I feel like a lot of foundations respect and will fund more, will provide more dollars, will provide it over longer periods of time, and will even consider unrestricted funds as well.
Darryl, you get I told you an hour is not very long. You get the last word here.
I don't know, but I don't know about a last word. That's a lot of weight given everything that that was just said. I don't have enough plus ones for all of my colleagues. So maybe I'll just leave with another thing that I am incredibly passionate about that we're not talking about right now with philanthropy. We talk about our organizations, we talk about who we fund, we talk about who's given us the money. Something that all of our organizations do is all of us have some sort of balance sheet of money that makes us more money so we can continue to exist. Are we looking at who our organizations are using to manage our money
Yes.
The banks that we're using to invest these significant amounts of dollars, right? So to the question of power, it's not only power in our seats to say, hey, we're going to invest more in our grantees who are people of color. It's also being in the rooms to walk with those who are making decisions on who are the investment managers that we're using.
Yeah.
Who are the banks that we're storing our resources in? So like, to me, that's another thing that I think we as people of color in this work need to continually do in the organizations that we're part of.
Yeah. I have to go back to Xiomara, and this has been a wonderful conversation, so we can wrap up and make sure you get everything you can out of the report. The one thing I do want to say is, like, part of what's been made it possible for me to stay in this work has been all of these people on this panel and the other folks. And I want to encourage folks who are working in philanthropy to make sure that they find their community and engage in that, so that when they have to make a brave stance, there's some community of people who are beside you and behind you, can make sure that you're taken care of. And I think that's really important, particularly when you think about challenging these foundations that don't have a lot of accountability for lots of reasons that are outside the individuals. But like a family foundation, they're gonna spend their money on, it's their money and their family. And when you challenge that, you might not be a good fit for the team. And I'm not saying that because it's the only thing that happens, but I am saying, you know, we walk in these spaces with a particular set of values, and that can be valued for a while and maybe not valued the next day. So I just really appreciate the collegial and the friendship and the family that folks have offered. And I think we have to keep doing that work. So Xiomara, back to you.
Thank you. Heather, Tulaine, Darryl, Brandon, Margarita, Francis, super, super appreciate you being here. Truly, I would be so happy to cancel the rest of my day to sit here and witness you all in conversation around this. We're gonna have to make this a whole lot longer next time. And you've pushed my thinking, and I know it really brings me some inspiration each and every time I know that you all are on the other end of a conversation as an organizational leader when I'm talking to funders and out there in the philanthropic world interacting. So thank you for the work you do every day. Thank you for pushing the sector forward from each and every one of your vantage points. It means so much. For everyone else, thank you for joining us. I want to make sure that you know that we have 2 more weeks of amazing sessions coming up. Next week, we will be in conversation about uprooting whiteness on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we're going to be amplifying voices of a number of our Native American Indigenous colleagues. And on Thursday, we're going to be diving into the growing Latinx gap. And I want to invite you to join us for any or all of those conversations, as well as the ones happening the week after. Second to last announcement for you all is that if you are in an organization that's looking for support to advance your work in this space, please, I hope you'll consider exploring the DEI Accelerator, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Accelerator program that Promise 54 runs. It's our flagship cohort 1-year program to help provide some support for advancing this work. So feel free to check that out and explore it. We are accepting applications for just a couple more weeks for the 2022 cohort. And now the very last thing I'd love to ask you to spend your last 2 minutes with us doing is just give us a little bit of feedback on your experience in this last hour. We'll use that to help shape the sessions coming up next week and the week after. We are a learning organization, and pour through that feedback and use it to inform our practice moving forward. So thank you for being here. Thank you for the active engagement through the chat. Thank you so much to each of our featured speakers. I really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us, and hopefully we will see you again next week.